Well, welcome to this webinar presented by the IET's Anglian Coastal Local Network, which represents members in Norfolk and Suffolk. Welcome also to folks from other parts of the UK and indeed globally. I'm really delighted to welcome you all. I'm Kevin Foster. I'm Chairman of Anglian Coastal IET Local Network, and I'll be your host for this evening. I'm delighted to introduce our speaker, Paul Mascal. Starting his career with Norfolk and Suffolk Constabularies in 2011, Paul worked within the intelligence field, later specialising in open source investigation within counter-terrorism. With the formation of their cybercrime unit in 2015, Paul became the Joint Force Cybersecurity Advisor, delivering awareness and working with regional and national partners. On leaving the force in 2017, Paul worked as law enforcement trainer in digital media investigation, forensics, open source, cybercrime, and communications data. He then worked as an independent consultant and trainer before joining UK Finance as head of cyber risk and technology. With a master's in conflict, governance, and international development, Paul has been a technology contributor for the BBC and has lectured on cyber psychology and is a proponent of digital well-being. Today, Paul will discuss our own security hygiene to keep ourselves and our data safe, even in the face of a rapid increase in fraud and cybercrime during the COVID pandemic. So Paul, over to you.
Thank you, Kevin, and good evening and good morning if anybody's anywhere from different time zones. So hello there. Just a quick amendment is I was head of cyber for my last role, but now I'm the manager for fraud and cybercrime prevention for the UK for UK Finance, and what I'll go on to is the DCPCU as well. Right, cybersecurity. We've talked at great lengths, and you probably have heard countless and countless ones of these presentations in relation to what to do about your cybersecurity, what to do in relation to protecting yourself and going about the right things. Now, if everybody can see that, and I think as far as I know, I'm sharing the screen, so that's all good. So from cybersecurity, and we talk about it, is that this might be a slightly different flavor of cybersecurity presentations that you're generally used to. Because when I started in cybersecurity, probably back in 2015 now, and worked in the security field, law enforcement, digital forensics for nearly now over 10 years, is that the fact that actually most of the time I talk about cybersecurity and security in this respect is that everybody asks me, no matter what role I'm in, what are the current trends? What are the things to worry about that are going on right now? Now, I will ask you and tell you one thing: no matter how technical minded you are, etc., and no matter how understanding you are about your cybersecurity, is that actually I can tell you everything you could possibly want to know about how to go about protecting yourself, security, the main things in order to do it and to protect yourself and being less of that low-hanging fruit in relation to hackers and fraud and scams and all these sorts of things. I can give you all that information, but actually it doesn't matter because actually all the information in the world that I can give you doesn't make any difference, because actually if you're not motivated to learn it, then you're not going to go away and actually enact it. Because the amount of times I've been on stage and I've done webinars and I've talked to people about cybersecurity and passwords and security and these elements around all these different factors that we can contribute to, most people still don't understand the real important factors of the security of themselves, and actually therefore very much not motivated. Now, when I talk about this and understand it from a cybersecurity point of view, is that actually I boil it down much more to our behavior, us being human, us looking at psychology, looking at behavioral analytics. I've lectured on cyber psychology in the past, etc., in relation to our relationship with technology. Because actually, technology isn't necessarily the problem. It's our relationship with it that really does need some work. And this goes for both cybersecurity, fraud, and all these different aspects. No matter what field you're in, no matter what capacity you're in, it all boils down to what we actually do with our technology and how we manage it and how we look at protecting ourselves in that respect. So I'm talking to you. Although I am employed by UK Finance as their national manager for fraud and cybercrime prevention, I'm actually seconded to the City of London and Met Police. Now, the City of London, with the DCPCU, which law enforcement, we do love our acronyms because it's a bit of a mouthful, but I am from the dedicated card and payment crime unit. So we are directly financed by the financial industry to look at card and payment crime, card not present fraud, all these different aspects. And what I was brought on not so long ago to do was to really diversify and look into both fraud and also cyber-enabled crime, economic crime, cryptocurrency. I do a lot of work around cryptocurrency and the criminality behind it as well, but also the positives behind crypto as well. But this is, in a nutshell, what I do now. But I want to start, and I know I'm one of those corny presenters that start with a quote because this is very much close to my heart, and this also sets the scene of what we talk around cybersecurity, especially in a much more working from home environment. We look at how to go about protecting ourselves, but this is going to be a lot more psychologically based than probably technical compared to what we're normally used to in relation to cybersecurity presentations. Because a gentleman called Bruce Schneier, one of my favorite cryptographers. He talks about security. He's a writer. He's done a lot of work in relation to Harvard. And if you find out, he does a lot around psychology of security and publishes a blog online. But one of my favorite quotes from him is that security is both a feeling and a reality, and they're not the same. Now, in my world, when I talk about fraud and cyber pretty much every single minute of the day, is that this has never, ever been more true in relation to our relationship with technology, but also the perspectives of fraud and cybercrime over the last year. Fraud statistics have risen over 667% in the last year alone, because it's not just us that are at home, it's also criminals. so the criminals have taken their option to really diversify into what their offerings are, and they've worked on their portfolio. But we have seen an astronomical, well, fraud was bad enough before, but we have seen such a massive increase in cyber-enabled crime, economic crime, all these exploitation, romance fraud, investment scams. All of these things have risen so much because we're all isolated at home. We're all more dependent on our technology in a lot of ways, but also the fact it comes down to the fact that actually they're not necessarily out there being able to commit more traditional forms of crime. So they're getting into a lot more of things like social engineering and phishing. And what they're going to realize is it's a lot easier for them to do that rather than any other form of crime. But when we talk about security, is that if I turn around to you and say, look, there's been a spate of burglaries in your area, 9 times out of 10, you're going to know what you want to do in relation to protecting yourself from that. You're going to make sure things aren't on display in your car or on your windowsills, or that you've made sure your house is locked at night, your car is locked, and all these belongings, etc., that mean something to you, that you value, has its rightful place and is protected. The problem is when we talk about technology and whether you know exactly how to protect yourself as an audience member, basically your family or your friends or your children or your grandparents or whoever it is most likely doesn't. So it comes down to the fact that we are asking people still, it's still only in the last couple of years, in the last 5 years, that we've even had cybercrime departments within law enforcement very often. We're still only looking in the last half a decade to a decade an uptick in the awareness around cybercrime to a point where it's an industry and it's a part of law enforcement stream and all these sorts of things. So we're still not really getting it. Now, again, like I said to you, is that if I could say to you all the things in the world and spend the rest of the evening talking to you about the technical elements of protecting yourself, but none of that matters because I'm asking you to learn a different language. Very often is that I'm asking very often people to say, right, okay, I want you to learn a foreign language, but I never ever want you to go to that foreign country or speak to anybody who speaks that language. Are you motivated to do it? No. And this is the same with technology and cybersecurity, and the protection and the methods and the motivation behind it is because most people see technology as much more of an emotional barrier, depending on your demographic, whether you're older or younger. Never always trust the younger person. They may be familiar with technology, but generally speaking, doesn't necessarily mean they're secure. And this goes for every demographic, every age, is it comes down to the fact that we are generally considered and conditioned to give data away and give information away. By that extension, we also don't value, and this goes for businesses, it goes for SMEs, it goes for organizations, and it also goes to the personal element as well, is that all the time, people don't necessarily value what it is that you're protecting. Because again, if I said to turn around to you and say, right, I want to put a password on your front door, most people would remember that password. Because the fact is, you're motivated to protect the things that it's securing. Online data, because over the last 10 years we've been conditioned to give it away, we don't value it as much, and you can't see it, touch it, and feel it. Humans and our psychology moves a lot slower than this technology. So it's about getting the idea and how we think about it in a different way. And especially if you're an educator or an individual that's working within an organization, very often your employees are there for a paycheck. They're not motivated to protect what it is that you're doing as an organization. So it all comes down to that value. But where you value something, you also see risk. Now, risk is the most irrational thing of everybody. It's based on very arbitrary elements and assessments of your biases and your psychology. Again, for instance, air travel. For the risk of air travel, actually, statistically, it's a lot more likely that you will die horribly on the road to the airport rather than up in the sky. But actually, because of things like the media and plenty of 1990s, 2000s films around air travel and air crashes, a pile up on the M25 doesn't actually, outside London, doesn't necessarily make good TV. So you build something, what's called the availability heuristic. And that's a complicated way of saying you assess risk based on the images you can bring to mind. Now, when it comes to that burglary, you can conceptualize it, you can understand it, you can see, touch, and feel what could be compromised. But when it comes to technology and cyber, still, we're in this position where we don't associate the risk in a proper fashion. But what now? Is that I've talked a lot around insider threat, the impacts of COVID in relation to cyber, information security, how we're managing our own security in this kind of new world, because we're all pretty much aware that actually things are not going to go back to the way they were. Organizational cultures are changing. Our environment has changed. All of these things, even when the restrictions have been, and we're years and years ahead into a post-COVID world. Are we going to be back in the office from 9 to 5? Are we going to be in that sort of situation? All different organizations are going to be very different. But this also changes risk, because security itself is very environmental. Is that, again, security is a feeling and a reality, and it's not the same. Because when you go into the office and you're securing your data, or you're securing your information, or you go into work anywhere specifically, is that very often you're geared and primed psychologically to protect yourself, to protect the data, to protect all the information that's within that office. There may be key cards, there may be CCTV, there may be security guards, whatever it is that security is very environmental. And it's based on your emotion depending on the context. But when we're looking at home, is that we thought the work-life balance and that divide was blurry before. I'm pretty sure it's going to be even more blurry from now on, especially in relation to this, because very often we're commuting across our hallways to work within our organizations, and we're seeing such a difference. For instance, CIFAS looked at a 43% rise in data loss from insider threat from a security point of view over the last year. And that reflects this idea that people are at home, People are losing jobs, their partners are losing jobs, financial impact from COVID, redundancies, all these sorts of things makes people darn sight more vulnerable to people exploiting them or offering them a chance of a lifetime to do something that in another environment they may associate as a criminal offense or something that's impactful on them. But this is where the whole thing will change, because we've got to understand that we're now protecting ourselves at home. We're protecting our families. And I always used to say before, security is like charity. It kind of starts at home. I know that's incredibly corny. I'm fully aware of this, but it's very true. But now it's even more literal. So how do you go about doing that? Is that what I talk about much more in relation to the impact of, okay, passwords and updating your devices, making sure your software is updated, back up things regularly, and look at securing your wireless router and all these sorts of things that we'll talk about in a bit. But the context, none of that really matters if you're not motivated to do it in the first place. But also the fact is that majority, or 98% of all cybercrime and impacts of fraud and scams and all these sorts of things in relation to your own personal hygiene comes down to wheedling you out as a low hanging fruit in relation to what security measures you do have, but also our own vulnerability. 98% of those attacks are social engineering, because everybody on this call at some point has been told something that you wanted to hear. And that's the real key aspect. And that social engineering and that isolation, the criminals are very exceedingly good to it. I've heard a lot of individuals and victim statements and recordings of criminal behavior in relation to actually how good they are at convincing you otherwise. Because cybercrime in its purest form in relation to hacking and things like that, yes, of course, it goes on in its absolutely astronomical amounts. But you have to understand that criminals and fraudsters and from a cyber-enabled crime is that they will generally choose the path of the least resistance. It will take me a lot of time to directly hack your organization or hack you, when actually I could just send out a couple of 100,000 emails and it's a numbers game that a couple of you will come back to me with some money. It's a lot easier. But it comes also down to our relationship with our own data. Is that your data, and as I said at the beginning, is that we've been conditioned to give it away for so long that we don't necessarily value it in the same way. Now, unfortunately, and from a cybersecurity point of view, I can tell you everything you need to know about protecting yourself to as much as you possibly can. No security is 100%. However, is it 9 times out of 10, probably we're all going to be victims of a data breach at some point. So no matter what you do in relation to protecting your data and protecting your computers and all these sorts of things, generally speaking, your data in some fashion, whether that be credit card details, whether that be your name, address, your personal data, all these sorts of things, will get out there. It's probably each week that we're probably looking at these aspects around a breach of some description of an online platform, an account, an organization, a business, or being victims of data breaches, and you having your data lost because of no fault of your own, just because you went with that service provider. So your data can be anywhere. It can be as easy as it is on things like social media. It can be when I was in counterterrorism, I was an open source investigator. And that's a very, very fashionable word of basically saying I was a professional Facebook stalker. It was a great job. But all the training in the world showed me that I didn't need all the training in the world to be able to do that job, because it's all readily available out there and cross-referenced between platforms and social media and what you post. And depending on your privacy settings, is that most data is out there anyway, especially on LinkedIn. It's particularly good. We like to put things on LinkedIn, but generally speaking, most of the information is from there as well. Your credit card details could go out there. Even now, we still deal with a great deal around check fraud and all these sorts of things, etc., especially for different demographics. But the impact of malware or malicious software or ransomware, all these aspects around data breaches and actual proper cybercrime or cyber dependent attacks. Individuals selling data online, both on the surface web, but also the dark web as well. But also the fact it comes down to, and as I said, around that social engineering aspect, that I can pretty much guarantee that most of the cases, even the most sophisticated attack that you could ever imagine, has started with an element of social engineering in some capacity. It started with an email. It started with a phone call. It started with me walking up in a sandwich uniform or a pizza uniform, etc. All these real sophisticated attacks started with an element of social engineering in some capacity. So what to do about that data, especially, is that the fact is, now this is a real example of what we've found from the DCPCU point of view. And your data very often is readily available on the dark web of some description. So this is an example of a marketplace that you can find online that has, again, we've got somebody from Norwich down here, etc., in relation to their credit card details, who they bank with, what country they're in, what address they're in, all these sorts of things that this impact can say, well, actually, I'm going to sell it for $11. I'm going to sell it for $18.60 or something along those lines. But the fact is all that data is out there and readily available. And it comes down to, okay, well, what do we do from our own personal security? And how do we go about actually understanding this impact? Because our data is out there all the time. There's a website called Have I Been Pwned? PWNED. And that's a very good website. You can put your email in and it comes out with what potentially, if you've been a victim of a data breach. I have a very big digital footprint, so I've been subject to loads of data breaches. But it's about understanding that this is a business. Your data is worth a lot of money. And these marketplaces work in very, very similar capacities to things like eBay. They have reviews. You can see just where I've blocked out the aspect. You've got a little star rating of 1,200 or 1,200. Sorry, I'm completely gone there. But how many their reviews are, because if a criminal uses your bank account and it doesn't work, I'm going to go back to them and say, hold on a second, this is duff. I wasn't able to use it. And they go, yeah, no problems. I'll just give you some for free. That's how they operate. It's an online marketplace in this respect. So how do you do it about yourself in relation to that data? Is it just assume that you may be victim of a data breach somewhere? Assume that your data could be going somewhere. And this is especially when you come to passwords, and we'll talk to them about passwords and reiterate that a little bit later on. But this is one of the biggest reasons why we talk about passwords in the way we do when we say don't repeat your passwords. Because if your password ends up on a marketplace like this, or a data breach, or a spreadsheet on some website somewhere in relation to that, because of that data breach, if you reuse that password as a hacker, the first thing I will do is try that password everywhere else. Because if you think about it, without the uses of codes and two-factor authentication, which again we'll go on to, 50% of your login for pretty much everywhere, your username is normally what? Your email. And what is your email? Your email is the single most publishable public thing about you as a person. And the other 50% is the password. So it's about understanding that this element of your data, etc., it's almost treating your security and your data like a fire door principle. So if you have a repeated password, it's like, again, if you're a victim of a data breach, then your data can get you into anywhere else if you repeat your password or you've got that poor cybersecurity hygiene. I just noticed the question from Doug about the website. Have I been pwned? PWNED.com, I believe. But we'll go through the questions at the end. I just wanted to cover that while I was thinking about it. So this idea of data. But bearing in that mind in relation to that data, because it's so easily accessible, because I can find so much online on social media, because I can go on LinkedIn or wherever it may be, is that this impact is that social engineering is even easier. I've done some security awareness courses for the oil and gas industry and different aspects when I was independent as well, before I kind of went back into the law enforcement like I am now. And we talked about the fact that actually I'm going to pick a Monday morning, or I'm going to pick a Friday afternoon, and send you an email that seems to be from HR about your pay. Because generally speaking, on a Monday morning, you're stressed, you're trying to pick up on emails, etc. On a Friday afternoon, you're maybe trying to get home, or whichever that case may be. And criminals will pick the time to make sure that you are in a much more vulnerable state. Because all of us, no matter how many times you have had an individual that said, look, okay, I've been defrauded, I've been scammed, I've been a victim of cybercrime, we have all been told something that we wanted to hear at the wrong time. So how does social engineering work? And this, I find it absolutely fascinating, because it exploits there is a flavor of fraud for everyone. Are you lonely? Have you been isolated over the course of this last impact of the COVID, etc. Like that? Have you lost loved ones? Have you breakdowns of relationships? All these sorts of things. Romance scams, romance fraud, and all these sorts of aspects. Online dating scams, online dating fraud, and all these sorts of aspects. Have you lost a great deal of your portfolio in relation to your money? Has investments gone down? Right, fantastic, investment scams for you. All of these things are very, very good, and they boil down, no matter what the threat is, it comes down to very, very simple analogies. And this goes for email, it goes for devices and phones and all these sorts of aspects. But what makes us so vulnerable in relation to fraud, especially nowadays? Because the general types of fraud have not changed for hundreds of years in relation to how they're doing it. It's just the flavor and the context that does. But what has exacerbated is technology. Now I talk about language at the beginning. We're asking ourselves to learn a different language, but also let's break down language into fundamental parts. Now, Albert Mehrabian, I think it was back in the 70s, talked about breaking language down into 3 component parts. 7% of your language is words, or are words. 38% is that voice quality. If I tell you I'm fine, if I was to text you that, generally speaking, if you were to read it in the right way, you would understand that I was fine. But actually, because you recognize my voice quality or something like that, you know that friend or that colleague is definitely not fine. But that 55% breaks it down, and we look at body language. Is that body language is a massive contributor to what you subconsciously and unconsciously really recognize about an individual and what they're delivering and what they're doing and how they're feeling. But when we look at this exponential rise in technology, our relationship with it, and this rise of fraud and cybercrime, is that we're seeing this fact that actually, what are we left with when we are talking about technology? When we're talking about social media, emails, text messages, all these different platforms, Zoom, another one as well, is that what we are very often left with is 7% of the communication. Now, have you ever taken a text message the wrong way for a partner? Or has a partner taken the text message the wrong way from you? Have you ever taken an email the wrong way from a colleague just because you're not really keen on them, or you're stressed, or all these sorts of things? I'm pretty sure the majority of us all have. Because what do we do with that 93% that is left? Is because then what technology and all these platforms that we are reliant on every day becomes subjective. You will read things in the way you want to read it. I've dealt with a lot of romance scams and things like that in the past, where people have been exploited online because they've believed that they could actually have a relationship. They've been speaking for a long time. They're speaking for months on end. And all this aspect is still a cyber-enabled or cybercrime or fraud, or all aspects. But it does come down to the fact that you will believe what you want to believe when you read it. And it depends on your level of cynicism, and it depends on your level of wants and hopes and dreams and fear and anxiety and depression and all these things that make up you come into that 93% of how people relationship with technology. So when it comes to social engineering, now DCPCU, we've become one of the biggest crime units in the UK that actually look at COVID smishing. So smishing, or SMS phishing, has become a massive, massive thing. And what criminals tend to do is set up with hundreds and hundreds of SIM cards, put them in basically a technical bank, and send hundreds and hundreds of thousands and thousands of text messages out to people. So we've had NHS vaccine scams, we've had census scams, we've had impacts around from a cybersecurity point of view with malware embedded in links and all these sorts of things. But it comes down to 5 things that we look at in relation to what basically looks at all of these things together. No matter what the flavor, no matter what the context, they will do one or all of these things. Putting across authority. An official organization, it might say, I'm your boss, I'm the NHS, I'm police, all these sorts of things. Again, it goes back to that kind of white coat syndrome. Is generally speaking, it's going to convey some sort of level of authority to you in relation to social engineering. A sense of urgency. Hello, I'm from your bank. We've detected an issue or a fraudulent behavior on your bank account. Please click this link in order to engage with it. Emotion. Again, like I said about romance scams, but also to trigger some sort of emotion, whether it's hope, whether it's fear, whether it's anxiety, or again, HMRC scams. One of the biggest ones that we see all the time is you're due a rebate of X amount of £100. Oh, excellent, fantastic. It's going to be a financial incentive and it's a positive emotion. And you look past that element of security. So, and again, comes down to this idea of scarcity. Is that investment scams have risen massively over the last X amount of years, especially last year, especially cryptocurrency investment scams have been one of the biggest in the last year. And it's because I'm trying to sell an element of scarcity. This is a one-time offer. This is something that you should really take. I'm only offering to you, and all these sorts of things that they are incredibly good at being able to manipulate people. They'll come with professional documentation. They'll come with all these different aspects. They'll even have a Google ad that you've clicked on to be able to come into an investment scam on that basis. Because cyber and fraud and all these sorts of things is a barrier that we falsely end up putting in, because the majority of crime comes from this element. But also current events. When you're looking at a massive current, and when we've looked at vaccine scams and census scams and all these sorts of things, criminals do like to be contextual. They really enjoy exploiting something that's very, very current. And that's why we've seen this massive, massive rise in the last year in that respect as well. So think about these 5 things. But also, we look at that majority of fraud is a numbers game. I will send out thousands and thousands of fraudulent emails or spam or phishing emails, etc., in hope that actually statistically a number of you will click on the link, a number of you statistically will give me money, and all these sorts of things. So it's a lot easier for me to just send that out and statistically wait for a good return, depending on it's a larger net. But when it comes to really good social engineering, where we look at things like CEO fraud, I'm going to identify that your CEO or your boss is online and is on holiday because he's posted it on LinkedIn, and I'm going to end up targeting an individual from the finance team to be able to say, right, okay, oh, it's such and such a person. I'm really sorry, I shouldn't be on my laptop, but can you make this transfer or make this payment, or at least send a link to embed malware or something like that in an organization. And this comes down to things like spear phishing and whaling. So it's a specific target, it's a specific individual that I'm aiming for, and all these sorts of aspects that will go from there as well. But again, it's that healthy level of cynicism and understanding that, okay, well, are they asking me to do something? Are they posing as an authority, or etc.? Has it come from their definite email and all these sorts of aspects? I would go through the aspects around identifying a phishing email, but we're limited on time today, etc. like that. So you probably gathered that I can probably talk for my country. But we also look at spoofing. Spoofing, and the middle icon, is incredibly easy to do nowadays, especially in relation to text messages. I can use an app and a piece of software to be able to send you a text that will come up in the same conversation field as O2, NHS, Vodafone, or whatever it is, whatever company you've engaged with. It will still, your phone will recognize it as it from the same sender, and that text will come in. And they operate in the same way that a phishing email would do, because it comes with links, it comes with a sense of urgency, a payment that has defaulted, or something along those lines that you've got to take action now in some capacity. So it's all about those due diligence. But those links can also take you to what's called a farming website, and it's with a PH, a farming website. Is that these fake websites? It's very easy for me to strip a website and create a fake version on somewhere with a more or less similar link in order to basically portray to you that I'm an official source or something along those lines. So if you imagine where we talked about the social engineering aspect, is that we can be as vigilant as we possibly can. Antivirus, passwords, all these sorts of things, but it still comes down to the human element so much more, even now in relation to what we do. We're at home, we're in a much more comfortable environment at home, and all these sorts of aspects. We are generally, I hate to say it very often, is that we are more vulnerable in this respect. We are looking at an anxiety and depression and a mental health epidemic across the country. People are increasingly isolated. It's very, very difficult to be able to really convey that sense of security and what to do in relation to support of an individual, etc. And the more vulnerable you are, generally speaking, the more unsecure you are in relation to how I could potentially go about exploiting you in whatever capacity it is. We're more likely to be able to click on that link. We're less likely to be aware of something on those lines, or pick these things up. So that's very much, again, if you take nothing away from today, is it, again, one of the questions that I've kind of seen out of the corner of my eye in relation to this, and this is where I was kind of going for this, is if you take nothing away from today, it's about understanding what it is that you value. It is about understanding what your loved ones, your friends, your employees, what do they value? Because if you take that value and actually convey the understanding of the impact of protecting their data, protecting their information, protecting their financials in relation to their online life and their online digital footprint, is that if you convey the two, like, you wouldn't be able to say, even from a point of view of, okay, well, if you're not using your passwords, this is the impact it could have on you, and these are the aspects in which you should take. But if you identify the value, then they see risk. Because if they appropriately see risk by the actual threats that are out there in relation to cybersecurity and fraud, and understanding that this is something that we've all got to really understand as the time progresses in relation to how we go about protecting ourselves, because our digital footprint will continue to grow more and more and more. It's becoming even harder to really monitor and reduce your digital footprint. So it's very much comes down to the fact that actually going out there and monitoring your own digital footprint, Googling yourself, searching information about yourself about out there, and having this awareness and an intentional awareness around the value that is out there about you. So this is much more in that context and understanding the value behind it. And this is why I then talk about the elements of what to do about protecting yourself. And we talk, first of all, passwords. Passwords comes down to these three elements. Now, if you take these three elements, very often it becomes majority of cybercrime, pure cybercrime and exploitation stops, because it's so effective, because this is one of the most common denominators in relation to any account takeover, your emails, or fraud, or cybercrime, etc., is that somebody's given their password, it's given access, or something along those lines. So password practice. We talk about the need for individual passwords all the time. We talk about symbols. We talk about making sure it's not dictionary words, all these sorts of things. And a lot of you are going, Yeah, but I can't remember that algorithmic hash that you're asking me to create as a password for every single of my devices. And that's the thing, is that very often that's impossible. I have 430 different passwords, and it would be absolutely impossible for me to remember every single one. But the difference is, it's like that fire door principle. If because I have a unique password for every single account, is that it means that if data inevitably is lost somewhere and that password is lost, then it's only that bit that's compromised, and it's almost that I can have that damage control and awareness of what's been affected and what I need to do to counter that data breach or whatever it may be. If you've reused your passwords, you have no concept of how much data or damage it could have on your life very often. Like your emails are the single point of failure, because where do you reset your security? Your emails. So that's why email account takeovers and impacts from phishing and all these sorts of things, the Microsoft 365 hacks and data breaches and all these sorts of things, but also just sending you an email pertaining to B365 to ask you to log in. If you give me access to your emails, I pretty much own a great deal of you, because it's very difficult to then, if they change the password, how do you alter that? So these are the two mitigating factors. Password managers, and again, one of the questions that have come up in relation to that. As a cyber psychology practitioner in relation to looking at technology in our relationship, I fundamentally support the use of password managers. Now, a lot of people will turn around to me and say, well, yes, but you're securing all your passwords in a single bit and it's a single point of failure. Yes, but the human element of actually remembering all those passwords and the laziness that we're intrinsically to do in relation to storing those passwords is far greater than the chances of that password manager being locked or broken into. LastPass, for instance, I use LastPass, but there's Dashlane. There are other ones available. They were hacked a number of years ago, but their data was encrypted, and that again, it means that basically, yes, it was lost, but the criminals couldn't do anything with the data that they stolen. So with password managers, yes, you have a password and username, but if you do use a password manager, absolutely use multi-factor authentication. Now that can be, and multi-factor authentication, again, if you're not aware what multi-factor authentication is, it comes down to a text message. It can come down to the element of the authenticator app. Google do one, Microsoft do one. I have everything through Microsoft Authenticator app, and I multi-factor everything. Because even if I give away my password because I clicked on a link, even because the password has been lost in a data breach, or I just typed it somewhere or left it on a bus, whatever it is, the multi-factor authentication means that they need access to that number, to that app, to that content to be able to gain access to it. So it's about understanding that multi-factor authentication is a real huge tool to be able to compensate for that. So good password practice, use a password manager to make it easier for you, but also look at multi-factor authentication on that as a best aspect as well. Now, one of the questions we've talked about recently and before I came on tonight is again about securing your own router. Now, most of the time, we don't change the factory settings that come with the router in relation to securing yourself at home. Now, again, comes down to whether you're clicking on links or how you manage your network and how you do it from a psychology point of view. But from that point of view, it's actually ensuring that the standard password that is used on the back of your router, that is changed, but also the name of the router, which is called the SSID, which you will see when you go into your settings and you'll see the name of that router, do give it a change. Because sometimes, very often, due to data breaches and all these sorts of things, is that the actual passwords that are issued with your router are put in the public domain or have been visited with a data breach. So it's not necessarily secure. I would strongly suggest being able to look at the instructions, have a look at it, visit the actual admin settings for your router, and be able to change those to something that is memorable, but it's not the default. So understanding that it's configured correctly and all these sorts of aspects that really contribute to it. Because even if it's just somebody next door, or if you live in a dense area or something along those lines, is that I'm not saying that it's highly likely, but it's something that, again, it's those due diligence around security. But updates, again, coming down to that social engineering idea, if I send you a link or a text message or an ability to download malicious software in your capacity onto your device or onto your computer, it will generally be reliant on the age of your computer or the age of the software in which has been released. So your application or whichever. So we joked we have really boring jokes in our industry, but we talk about the Windows XP and the impacts of out of date operating systems and all these sorts of things. But if you don't update, the analogy is that probably over 300,000 pieces of malicious software are created every day. So imagine that sea level rising that quickly every day. Is that your software, your application developer, your antivirus and your firewall, all these sorts of things are rising and plugging vulnerabilities, plugging security issues, looking at new malware, etc., and being able to identify it. That's why, again, good malware and anti-malware and firewall on your computer is a must, because actually that's your last line of defense. Because if you've clicked on that link and you download a piece of malware, if it can then identify, hold on a second, there's something a bit untoward here, that's the real importance of it. Now, whether it's free, whether it's paid for, just have one, please, and keep it updated along with your device and all these sorts of things. Because 9 times out of 10, most, even on a Windows, on a Mac, don't think that you're extra more secure on a Mac, because again, yes, it's more secure in its more infrastructure in its operating system, but it won't stop you clicking on a link and you allowing it in. So it's still as much a risk as anybody else. So updating that software, updating as much as you possibly can to make sure of that as well. And backups are really, really important in relation to this. Is that, again, if I've clicked on that link, I look at ransomware, or ransomware has encrypted or locked my computer and they're asking for money, or they're asking for cryptocurrency in response to that. These are the impacts that we're looking at in relation to, if you've got a good backup that's not attached to your system. So it can be to the cloud, it can be to a separate box or a separate computer, etc., that's gapped or air gapped from your computer as well. It's just something that's separate, that's not necessarily connected to your computer all the time. Because if you click on that link and something goes untoward, you're able to then wipe the computer and restart, instead of actually losing a lot of that data as well. So backups are incredibly important in that respect as well. So I allowed for a little bit extra time to talk about these questions, because although we've had so many different questions I've looked at, and I've tried to kind of answer it as we're going along. But again, is it all the technical cybersecurity aspects and IT systems and all these sorts of things are incredibly good, but majority of the stuff that I come across in relation to fraud and cyber and economic crime especially comes down to us, comes down to individuals in relation to this impact. So Kevin, I think if do you want to administer the questions from that point of view, or shall I go for it? It's entirely up to you.
Thanks very much, Paul. That's certainly, you've covered a lot of material there, and there's a huge amount of food for thought there for me personally. I'm sure there'll be quite a few questions. I'd like to hand over to Ian now to manage the questions for you. So over to Ian.
Okay, thanks, Kevin. You've answered some of the questions live. Thank you very much, Paul, as we've gone through. So that's good. That makes it a bit easier. There's one, I think, here which is very relevant, and that is, what approach have you found to best motivate others to engage with cybersecurity? We've heard what you've said about the problems of it, but how do you motivate others to do it?
That's one of the best questions I can imagine, really, to be fair, because that is, in my opinion, is one of the biggest challenges that we have in relation to cybersecurity and fraud. Because especially from a business point of view, the amount of times I've gone to an organization and we've talked about the threats, we've talked about the impacts, we've talked about what can happen, but there's actually something called prospect theory. And this explains very often the psychology around why people don't do it. So if I give you two choices, A or B, if I say, right, I'm going to give you £500, or B, I'm going to get, you've got a 50% chance at £1,000. Generally speaking, is that when we talk about that, majority of people will go for A. Depends on the gamblers amongst us, but the majority, I think it's about 85% of people will go for A because it's a sure thing. There's 50% that you might get nothing, and 50% might get £1,000, but the £500 from that point of view is actually a sure thing, and I'm going to take that. But if I switch that round and say, right, A, I'm going to take away £500, or B, you've got a 50% chance of losing £1,000. All of a sudden, everybody, because of the reframing, everybody, and then again, the percentage shift it's not always the same case for everybody, but most people turn around and go, well, actually, I'm going to go for B, the 50% at losing £1,000. Because if I frame something negatively to you, you are going to be a risk taker. If I frame something positively to you, you become risk averse. So when we go into businesses, when we go to our friends, our family, our grandchildren, etc., when we go, if this doesn't happen, the world will end and you will be hacked and all these bad things will happen. But it's a psychological deterrent to say, if you phrase something negative, I'm going to actually more likely become more risk taking because I can't conceptualize of the risk. I don't, especially from a business point of view. But the way to motivate it is to look at the language, look at what they value and what those individuals and the businesses value. Again, most of the time when I was independent and I was talking to businesses and looking into cybersecurity and doing that kind of consultancy side, I was saying, okay, well, if this is your business and getting to know their business from that point of view, I would turn around and say, well, actually, if this was to happen, this would happen. So if you were a ransomware, how would you go about doing your work? What's your resilience like? What's all these sorts of things? Put it in the context instead of going that kind of more doom and gloom sort of, this is going to happen. People, generally speaking, if they're not from this industry or they're not already aware and you're already talking to them in that fashion, it's about understanding and making it relatable to them in every possible conceivable way. Even then, sometimes they won't do it, but that's the way I do it.
Okay, thanks, Paul. The next question that I can see is, this may be outside your scope, but it says or asks, what is the likely evolution of cyber defense mechanisms that can prevent or deter attempted incursions into company IT systems by state actors, i.e. states or agencies? That's from John.
Well,
so I don't know whether there's anything
enough,
you can say about
well, oddly enough, I did actually spend some time within the Specialist Group Information Services as a captain within Royal Signal. So this is actually something along my lines. And because I've worked in law enforcement and counterterrorism and all these sorts of things, a lot of that stuff kind of bleeds into the aspects of state actors. Now, with the state actors, they're generally speaking, they're called APTs, or advanced persistent threats. So state actors will generally go from multiple different capacities. They've got all the resources in the world to be able to break into a system or etc. like that. Now, I honestly think that from the future of the point of view is that, again, it comes down to what platforms, what software, all these traditional cybersecurity advice that we look at. But it's the things around threat detection that we probably look in the future in relation to things like Darktrace, artificial intelligence born organizations and platforms and applications that are applied to our networks. So that's very much a future because, for instance, IoT or Internet of Things, so your smart baby monitor, your TV, all these sorts of things, very often, especially in the state actor approach, is that we can end up kind of breaking into those because they're less security than everywhere else in your house. But what things like Darktrace and a lot of these other platforms do is recognize unusual connections. unusual traffic and things like that that's beyond the norm. And this traffic monitoring is really, really important, especially in relation to understanding whether any attack, whether it be from, say, actors. But really brutally honest, until a lot of these things are developed in relation to how we secure organizations, we look at ISO 27001, our management, good cybersecurity hygiene, it still very much comes down to staff education and awareness, even in these larger organizations, because again, it's a lot easier for me to identify and exploit and manipulate an individual than it is to break into a system. Again, I used to work around critical national infrastructure. It'd be a lot easier for me to convince and bribe an individual to take a USB stick and plug it into somewhere rather than try and break into the system. So again, yes and no, and that I think that's going to be very much the development around, yes, good technical systems, but we've still got a long way to go around education.
Okay, good answer, Paul. Thank you. The next question is a techie one. Isn't IP version 6 a lot more secure than IP version 4? And why isn't there a bigger update of it? I don't know whether that's in your ability to answer it.
Absolutely. So yeah, again, it's a really good question. So yes, IPv6 is a darn sight more secure than IPv4. Now, why isn't there a bigger uptake for it? Logistics, money, organizations being able to implement it and actually put it into the systems, etc. And again, it's very much the same with most cybersecurity and technological updates in relation to how we administer a lot of our organizations and our software and our security measures. It very much comes down to those elements where how would we go about doing it? How do we go about on mass updating software and updating settings in relation to people's homes, people's organizations, and all these sorts of things? And again, so a lot of the software applications and hardware that has been created before very often ties in with IPv4 in relation to our existing network and connections. So again, I know it's a very, very different thing, but we look at, for instance, the digital switchover for our own telephone systems. We are looking at a great deal of change in relation to the digital switchover, because of a lot of our security systems and applications will become null and void when we go on to a VoIP system. So again, all these things, there's security things, pluses for the side, but there's also a lot of work and investment and finance on one side as well to move across. Again, why do you think most organizations in military spending has about a 10-year lead time before anything gets done? Because again, trying to develop those sorts of systems on that sort of scale is quite difficult.
Good, thank you, Paul. There's a question here from an anonymous attendee. Is there any benefit of linking your digital fault to a biometric finger reader such as on a mobile phone? I think what it's saying is your digital password or whatever to finger reader. Yeah. So
yeah, so again, goes the same for Face ID. My password vault that I have on my phone is linked to my face, etc. But if it doesn't recognize my face because I had a late night or something along those lines, then yeah, okay, it's also got my digit code, etc. to be able to get into it. I strongly, again, going from a psychological point of view and a behavioral point of view, anything that makes security easier. Because security for everyone, whether that be physical, whether that be cyber, whether that be counter fraud, is that it comes down to a convenience versus security trade-off. Everything is that the amount of times I was kind of pseudo head of IT for my last company before I joined the fray back in law enforcement, etc. And it's hilarious because again, is it something that adds another step just because, and it makes them more secure. For instance, I introduced multi-factor authentication for all our devices and technology, and my God, it was basically like I just killed their firstborn. So because it does come down to a trade-off, because you're reliant on you remembering passwords and all these sorts of things that come into it. So any element of biometrics and how they're also stored is generally encrypted. It's very, very difficult to match biometrics in that respect in the general scheme of things. Yes, it's possible. Anything's possible, and no security is 100%. But when we're bypassing the human element and we're making it easier for people to be more secure, then I think it's a very, very good thing. So I'm all for any elements of two-factor authentication or biometrics.
Great. Okay, thanks, Paul. A question here. Do you think legislation can make a difference with people's handling of their online profile? I'm not quite sure what legislation he's thinking of, but
I think what we're talking about, and what I gather from that, is that, again, looking at, for instance, the changes in GDPR or the General Data Protection Regulations, and the impact of our understanding around our personal data. Now, the problem is you're always going to have this big balance between privacy and online security and the impacts of that. So one of the two. So I strongly believe that privacy online is incredibly important, and the ability to manage your digital footprint or your online profile, and whether that be social media. But the difference is it's about, most people are entirely unintentional about what they post, what they do, what they put out there. Now, GDPR, again, yes, it gave the Information Commissioner's Office and European agencies a lot more teeth in relation to dealing with the data, but there was nothing really new around the data protection legislation that was from before in relation to managing personal data and all these sorts of things. So although it gave more teeth, it was still in legislation. I honestly think, depending on what, again, managing your online profile, it is a much more societal and cultural issue, and not necessarily one from a legislation point of view. Because again, the internet's not going away. It's getting more and more encroaching. We have a lot more addiction in relation to our social media habits and online profiles and all these sorts of things. But it's about having an intentional awareness of what is out there about you and how you manage it. I don't foresee, or I'm not aware of, any legislation lobbied for or otherwise in relation to it. However, there is a big move from the government, and there's a lot of talk from within the Home Office and all these sorts of things in relation to what we convey as digital identity and how we verify our identity in the future. So that could have a massive impact on how we manage our online profile and what we put out there as well.
it's probably related to the next question from David Hill, actually, Paul, because he asks or states that DCMS is introducing an IoT cybersecurity legislation. How much difference do you think that will make? So it's probably related to your previous answer in some ways.
It makes sense. It completely makes sense in relation to that. Because again, the first one I felt was much more around how do generally people will manage their online profile. And this is much more around network security and how we look about all these sorts of things. Because historically, and David, you're very, very, very correct in relation to that, is that from an IoT point of view, it's always been about public consumership. It's been much more, the devices are created on the basis of functionality and ease and convenience, voice control devices, TVs, all these sorts of things to add that extra functionality. But the problem is, because of the limited computing power and the different aspects of that come into those devices, they don't necessarily have the ability to secure themselves in the way they do. The big attack on the East Coast, where it basically shut the internet down for the East Coast of the States, were predominantly all IoT devices that were used in what's called a distributed denial of service attack on the East Coast of America. And they were all webcams, TVs, all these vulnerable devices. Now, I honestly believe that again, legislation takes a lot of a lot of time to be able to encroach on these sorts of things. And I work a lot around the Digital Policy Alliance, which there are kind of a lobbying group in relation to briefing government and DCMS, for instance, on these sorts of principles. But I do believe that because it's going to set a certain standard and legislation around the cybersecurity and the expectations of security around IoT, is that after time, we will start seeing the phase out and good proper updates in order to match that legislation and understanding. So I do think, again, it's one of those big holes in our own home Wi-Fi's and our networks in relation to improperly secured IoTs.
The next question is on the same lines, actually, Paul, because it's, legislation we know through GDPR gives people the right to forget. This attendee says, how effective is the right to forget, such as through Google? So even though there is a right to forget in law, is it effective?
That's a tough one, because I fundamentally believe that the privacy in the data is absolutely paramount, and the ability to make an intentional choice about where my data goes, what happens to it, and if my data is being looked after by somebody else, then I have the right to be able to revoke that or change it, or all these sorts of things under those personal data rights. The amount of information and the stuff you have to normally go through in relation to, and the effort that most people have to go through in order to get the right to forget and all these sorts of things, and applications go through in order to get that data removed, is quite substantial, depending on the organization, depending on where you go. Some it's easier, some it's not, but they have it within their organization to be able to allow it. Going back to right at the beginning where we talked about value, if people don't necessarily value the personal data in which it's got, are they going to look at the effort that requires to get rid of that personal data or that information about them, to be able to delete it and to go through it? No, not necessarily. And for the general public I'm talking about. For an individual, yes, it's very effective if you really want to go out and minimize your digital footprint and be able to delete your data. But for the general public, they don't value it in the first place. So that's the difference. And most people aren't aware of their own privacy rights.
Yes, I think we'll make this the last question if we can, because time is getting on. But another attendee asks, do you think that publishing more information about the risk, e.g. like a dashboard that we have for COVID, would help people understand the risk better?
No. And I'll elaborate, because the problem is, again, like I said about the aspect of, there's almost this sense of warning blindness. We have tweeted, we've social mediated, we've advertised, we've talked about cybersecurity threat. Your banks will blast you with adverts and information around your own behavior and what you do in relation to your devices and technology and passwords and how you manage all this. And the risk is constantly out there in some capacity, in some way, shape, or form. Whether most of the time you know of somebody who has been victim of a fraud or a cybercrime or a virus or something like that. We are all generally aware of the risk. The problem is because it's still something that we can't necessarily conceive of. Our own biases work against it because of our own emotional barrier towards technology. It's very, very difficult for us to conceive a threat that we can't touch, feel, or see or experience. And with COVID, it was very much, yeah, okay, well, not being funny, but you've got a dashboard for COVID, but we've just had this massive march in the center of London that took over the entire shopping street in relation to people who still don't believe that it's real or it's a conspiracy and all these sorts of things. So people don't generally, again, the way we conceive risk is entirely irrational. So it's very much around looking at the wording in which we do. I think it's going to be much more a generational thing before we have a really good idea around managing our own digital footprint and our own online life the same way you would do anything else. It's about dividing, taking away this technological barrier, because there isn't anything. Because what would life be without technology? Whether you like it or love it or hate it, doesn't matter. It's still the most systemic thing in your environment or your life. Ian, you're on mute, mate.
Sorry, I was having a cough when the last one happened. I said it would be the last question, but there is just one more, which I think is a very quick yes or no one. Before handing back to Kevin, it says, would you recommend changing the default PIN when you get a new credit card? And with that, I think when you've answered it, we'll hand back to Kevin.
It depends. If it's something that's 0, 0, 0, 0, or something that would be easily seen or replicated, if I was to look over your shoulder in relation to your PIN on your credit card or wherever it is, then again, I haven't used my PIN for X amount of years because I'm a strong believer in things like Apple Pay and all these and electronic payments. But however, is that if it's something that's easily like and it's not something that's easily available, then yes, change it. I would say maybe something a little bit more different in relation to that. But it's rare that that's the case. So I wouldn't recommend it unless you can think of a reason why.
My thanks to Ian for grouping the presentation, grouping the questions and asking them to Paul. We did have a lot of questions, and Paul, thanks for going through all of them. I'd like to really draw your attention to our next webinar, and that is The Eyes of the Few, a world first, and that's the story of Bawdsey Radar. So finally, on behalf of the IET Anglian Coastal Local Network, I'd like to thank you all for joining the webinar tonight. I'd like to thank our speaker, Paul, for the time he put in to make the presentation and to deliver a great presentation, and to the team who put on tonight's webinar. My thanks most sincerely. So that concludes the webinar.